Welcome to episode 34 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Today we'll be reading from approximately line 865 in the Latin edition. Let's join the discussion with Elaine reading today's text.
Now farther, those beings we see endued with sense, you must needs own are produced from insensible seeds, nor is there anything we perceive by common experience which refutes or opposes this opinion. Everything rather leads us on and compels us to believe that animals, I say, proceed from principles that are void of sense. For we observe living worms come into being from stinking dung, when the earth, moistened by unseasonable showers, grows putrid and rotten. Besides, beings of all kinds undergo continual changes. The waters, the leaves, and the sweet grass turn themselves into beasts. The beasts convert their nature into human bodies, and the bodies of wild beasts and birds increase and grow strong by these bodies of ours. Nature, therefore, changes all sorts of food into living bodies, and hence she forms the senses of all creatures, much after the same manner as she quickens dry wood into fire and sets everything in a blaze. You see now it is of utmost importance in what order these first seeds are ranged, and when mingled together what motions they give and receive among themselves. But tell me, what is it that lays a force upon your mind? What moves you? What drives you into another opinion, that you should not believe a thing sensible can be formed from insensible seeds? Perhaps you observe that stones and wood and earth, when mingled together, can produce no creature endued with sense. But you will do well to remember, upon this occasion, that I did not say things sensible or sense could instantly proceed from all seeds in general, which go to the production of beings, but that a great consequence of what size the seeds are that created a being of sense, with what figures, motions, order, and position they are distinguished. Nothing of which we observe in wood or clods of earth. Yet these, when they are made rotten by moisture, produce worms, because the particles of matter, being changed from their former course by some new cause, are so united and disposed that living creatures are formed and creep into being. Besides, those who contend that a sensible being may be raised from sensible seeds, and this you are taught by some philosophers, must needs allow those seeds to be soft, for all sense is joined to bowels, nerves, and veins, all of which we know are soft, and consequently liable to change and dissolution. But grant their seeds to be eternal, yet if they are sensible, each seed must be endued with sense, either as a part or a whole, and be like a complete animal of itself. But no single part can perceive or exist of itself, for each part requires a union with the other parts to make it capable of sense. Nor can the hand feel any more, or any other part retain its sense when separated from the body. These seeds therefore must be perfect animals, and so unite together in a vital sensibility. But how then can seeds be said to be eternal and secure from death, when they have the nature of animals and are one and the same with them in all respects, and therefore are mortal and must die? But allow these seeds to be sensible and incorruptible too, yet by their union and agreement they can produce nothing but animals and things sensible. That is, mankind and cattle and wild beasts can produce nothing but men and cattle and wild beasts. How then could things insensible, such as trees, metals, have a being? If you say these seeds in mingling together lose their own proper sense and assume another, what need you impute any sense at all to them when they must lose it again? Besides, as we've proved before, since we perceive the eggs of birds are changing into living young, and that worms break out of the earth, when it is made rotten by unseasonable showers, we may conclude that things sensible may arise from insensible seeds. If anyone will assert here that sense indeed may proceed from insensible seeds by a sort of change made in the seeds, by virtue of the thing that generates before the animal is formed, it will be sufficient plainly to show him that no animal can be formed but by a union, first of the seeds, nor can anything be changed but by agreement of the seeds, so that there can be no such thing as sense in any body before the animal is completely formed. And for this reason, because the seeds lie scattered in the air, the water, the earth, the fire, nor have they yet united together after a proper manner into any vital motions by which the senses of any animal may be produced in order to guide and preserve it.
Okay, thank you, Elaine, for reading that. We've been spending a couple of weeks talking about things like colors and that the atoms do not have color, but now we're into more probably a payoff to that earlier argument that if atoms do not have color and other qualities like that, how can they possibly have sense in themselves? And of course, that leads us into much deeper issues about whether living beings can come from inanimate seeds, and which is generally, I think, the topic we're going to discuss today. So who would like to start?
Charles, what do you think?
I'm rereading all of it. Hold on.
It's always easiest if we go back just through the details of each sentence as well if we need to. While you're looking, we can see from the very first sentence of what we're discussing today that his standard to which he appeals is experience. He says, now further, these beings we see endued with sense you must needs own are produced from insensible seeds, nor is there anything we perceive by common experience which refutes or opposes this opinion. We've been discussing in some of the threads on EpicureanFriends.com the aspect of the canonical analysis in which you look to see whether there's anything that opposes or refutes the conclusion. You may not have enough positive evidence to say that a particular conclusion is the correct one, but if you begin to see evidence that refutes something, you can eliminate among the possibilities that particular option. And so he's looking to experience to see whether there's anything that refutes the position that sensible beings can come from insensible seeds.
Yeah.
Maybe we should even discuss when he talks about sense. It's easy to start talking about, well, is he talking about consciousness? Is he talking about living beings? But he uses the word sense throughout here. Is that the same as referring to living beings or conscious beings?
Consciousness. I was wondering that, or if it meant actually the senses.
There's not a lot that I recall.
Everybody's using the same word there. Let's go to Martin Ferguson Smith and see what word he uses.
That'd be good. I do not have my copy of that with me today.
He uses sensible and insensible. Interesting. I mean, when I'm reading this, I'm thinking of the senses and to be able to perceive, the ability to be able to interact with the environment by sensing it. Okay, so Stalling says, next we must admit that animals that sense and feel are made of insensible particles. I mean, it's still related to consciousness, but it's specifically being able to perceive, to sense, I think.
You know, I don't recall there's a lot of discussion in the Epicurean text about the word consciousness or anything that really equates to that.
Yeah, it may be a later kind of concept language, because I would limit this to the senses. I mean, there's some parallels you can draw with the hard problem of consciousness and so on, but I bet he's really talking about sensory perceptions.
Which means presumably he's not talking about plants. Or what do you think about that?
Well, actually,
plants, does he? I don't think so.
Further down, he says in third section here at the end, how then could things insensible such as trees, metals have a being?
Okay, interesting.
So he's not seeing plants as having sense organs, which may not be the case. Theirs may just look different from ours because the chemical receptors, there's a lot of communication going on with plants. I don't know that we can say they have the kind of nervous system that can have feeling, but sense, probably not the way we think of it, of the experience of sense, but it's interesting.
Yeah, even going back to the principal doctrine number 2, where he says death is nothing to us, but that which is dissolved is without sensation, and that which lacks sensation is nothing to us.
Right.
So it really is probably a pretty deep issue that he's equating sense as the indicia of, I'm going to use the term animate life. I don't even know what that means really. Animate life, does that mean higher beings above plants, or are plants animate life?
Well, animate means something that moves, right? Animate life is not.
That's a good question. It may mean animus, meaning spirit in Latin.
Maybe it's just as simple as like sentience.
Well, but what does that tell us? What is sentience?
Okay,
that it's capable of feeling things, which is very similar to sense.
Yeah.
Well,
I was thinking it more in biological terms, that it would having the quality or ability of motion, that it would be an animal form. Although plants, of course, move. So, you get a Venus flytrap that's animated.
Right.
So I'm thinking about whether anything that we observe or he could observe would refute what he said in this first section here that's in paragraph form in Brown, because obviously the worms aren't coming. I mean, they are. So it's not that you just get the ground wet and worms spontaneously arrive. There were eggs.
Right. Clearly, there's small eggs that they can't see, that they're not accounting for.
Yeah. But the minerals, I mean, all of those things go into the forming the body of the worm according to its DNA template. So, I mean, they're incorporated into it, I guess would be the word that I would say, even though it's not just like you get it wet and they appear. Yeah, he didn't know any of that, but the underlying process of inanimate becoming part of the body of the animate, I mean, that's true. So I don't really see anything to disagree with that basic conclusion.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail in what we have as our first two paragraphs, but I guess in the beginning of the third is what the general topic really is, which is that some philosophers teach that sensible beings like human beings must ultimately come from sensible seeds, and that you can drill down deeply enough, and that at some point there are small sensible seeds that all living things come from. And he's going to argue that that's not the case.
Right. And so it's still a matter of some controversy today. I mean, this is what they call, or some people will call, the hard problem of consciousness. And there are even people who I think are probably wrong, but still believe in this panpsychism, that there must be some property of matter which has rudimentary consciousness, not complex enough to be anything like what we would imagine, but there has to be some kind of property in matter which allows that it wouldn't just appear. But I think the prevailing idea is that consciousness comes about during the process of complexity. And I think this section overall suggests to me that he was going in that direction, that it's a property of complexity, that not of the seeds themselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. Would it be wrong to you use the word consciousness in what you just said. Would it be overgeneralizing it to just say that the issue here is whether life can come from non-life? Is that what he's wrestling with, or do you think he's wrestling with something different than that?
Well, I think it's at least a parallel. If we stick to what he's saying, that is the senses, I think that's really looks clear, because think about something as complicated as your olfactory receptors in your nose. If you disrupt those, like maybe by a COVID infection or some other injury to those receptors, you can't smell anymore. So you break those apart and that sense is gone. So there clearly has to be a specific arrangement, a complex arrangement to allow that the sensory organ to work in your brain to process it, for you to have that experience of smelling something. And that's not it's an emergent property of the arrangement of the seeds. It's like the words, from the letters, not in the seeds themselves, are not olfactory organs. I think that is supported by all of our observations, what he made and now.
When you first started that last paragraph of your statement, Elaine, I wasn't completely sure that I agree with it, but I do think that it is very useful to stick with what he is saying, because he's talking about sensation and sense, and that may mean something different to him than it may mean to us. We don't necessarily know what implications are behind his use of a particular term at a particular time. So when I look back and continue to think about the parallel between this and Principle Doctrine number 2, when he says death is nothing to us, that which lacks sensation is nothing to us, well, all he's saying is that death is the absence of sensation. He really hasn't said death is the absence of life or the absence of consciousness. I mean, you can imply all those things, I think,
Yeah.
But really, all he has said is that death is the absence of sensation. Or absolute, I'm not even sure he's really said that. He just says that whatever happens at death, you no longer have sensation. And if you don't have sensation, then it's not relevant to us. So I think your approach of just really taking it at face value to start with is probably very valuable, because I think he probably means more than just saying absence of sensation, but that's what he said, is absence of sensation. And here he's talking about things that have the ability to have sensation coming from things that do not have sensation. He hasn't really said the word life or consciousness or animus or anything.
Do they really at that time think about it as being separate things?
See, that's the question.
Interesting.
That's the question. I don't know whether they did or not, and that's what we would have to drill down and find out in order to trace out the implications. But you are right in saying that he is talking about sensible seeds and sensation and sentient beings. Does that equate to the question of life? It's not really obvious to me that it does, or it's probably closely connected to it, but is it the same thing? What word would he be using if he were talking about life?
Vitality.
Yeah, like I was saying, vivo, like I live, like
maybe something a bit more abstract, like elan vital.
Right. So
Latin is vivus, alive, living.
Yeah, so he could easily, or Lucretius, and I'm thinking about Epicurus, but Lucretius could easily be putting in here something about vivus, and that does not appear to be the word he's using. He's using sensation.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that would be the case, but that's what we're dealing with.
So this makes me think of sensory deprivation takes.
Right.
And you still have experience even when you're deprived of sensory input. So that's not the whole of consciousness. But I think that today, at least, we can go further and say that we don't have any evidence that anything that we would recognize as consciousness, let me just say that would feel like consciousness to us is a property of dirt, so.
Yeah, I think that level is the way this is intended and needs to be analyzed. That's where he's going with it, even though there may be some distinctions that we probably ought to keep in the back of our mind. That seems to be the direction. Because of the issue that bothers me, what about the issue of, if we think that this is a matter of life coming from non-living things? I believe there is a part in the book later on where he says that the earth is getting old or something like that and doesn't produce things like it used to. But presumably the process he's talking about of living things coming from non-living things is a continuous process that continues to go on. And what's the implication, Elaine, of that? He says that the universe is eternal. So these processes should have been going on eternally. There should never have been a time when the process did not go on. It certainly, if the earth was created at a particular time and in a particular explosion, then there'd be a particular time that it first started on earth. But if he's taking the position that the universe is eternal, then this is a process that should have been capable of going on eternally.
I'm starting to see some echoes of the previous statements from book 1 about how the seeds and being birthed from the seeds. Does that ring a bell?
Say it again.
I'm seeing echoes of the sections in book 1 that talk about men being birthed from the sea and seeds.
Oh, yes.
Right. Well, that part was talking about how we just didn't fantastically spring out of nothing. And it is kind of a contrast with this section where you get the dirt wet, the worms come up. So, yeah, I thought about that too. It's like, he's kind of going back on what he said in the beginning.
Well, but those statements in book 1 you're talking about, Charles, mostly, I think they were statements that we do not see those things
Right,
happening.
that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's what Charles is saying too. It's like we don't see that, and then here he's talking about things kind of springing out of the inert, inanimate elements. But I guess I would go more on that there are predictable appearances of things, and so we're not seeing. We could more focus on we're not seeing bizarre and unpredictable things like humans springing fully formed out of the ocean, but we do see worms come out of the dirt. We just didn't know that they were eggs.
Yeah, the point point that you guys are just talking about, I think to some extent that's addressed in this second paragraph where he says, I did not say that sensible or sense things could instantly proceed from all seeds in general, which go to the production of being. Right. And so that's really actually a significant part of the rest of this passage is where he goes back to this argument that the atoms have to be arranged in particular arrangements and motions and orders and positions and so forth.
Yeah.
In order for these things to happen. Because that's what came to mind as a potential contradiction, probably as the answer to his question about what drives you to the other opinion that can't happen. Because you don't just see stones and wood and earth mingle together haphazardly and instantly producing men or birds or fish. You don't see that at all. So
back to your question, Cassius, about whether this has been just ongoing somewhere in the universe. I don't think that is my understanding of what current cosmology theories support, but I don't think it matters. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really change that I'm not seeing anything supernatural. I'm not seeing any requirement for a supernatural in anything that happens. So
I would definitely say there's no requirement of the supernatural, but as far as whether it makes any difference to you or not, it's probably because you have not finished watching those episodes of Star Trek that you said you were going to be watching. Because if you had been watching those episodes, you'd be intimately concerned about whether there's life out there in the stars or not.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that is of no significance. I actually was addressing more your question about whether all of this was constantly going on, and humans or other life forms constantly being eternally this process. And I don't think we have any reason to think that that's true. But whether it's true or not would not change anything about what I'm going to do today.
Right. It might change. What you ought to do today probably would include watching some more Star Trek episodes, so you'd be more acclimating your mind to these arguments. Charles, the Physics Corner has spoken today about life on other parts of the universe. What do you think about that?
It's I know there's a ton of nuance behind a lot of theories, but I think it's possible. Just leave it at that.
Do you expect astronauts, the further and further they go out, to find some forms of life? I mean, they constantly are talking about Mars this, Mars that, and whether they've found anything there or not. But when the further they go out, do you expect life to be found?
Not by us.
And when you say by us, that's a matter of time, you mean, or ever?
A little bit of both. For the foreseeable, I don't know how many generations from now, it won't be us in that sense.
Yeah. Elaine, do you follow those? I mean, NASA's constantly talking about findings on Mars and so forth. Do you follow that at all and have an opinion about what they say?
I look at some of that stuff when it comes up. It's interesting. So I don't want to give the idea that I don't think it's interesting or that I don't enjoy thinking about it. But whether there is life right now on other planets or has been in the past or will be in the future is a different question from whether it's been going on eternally. So those are two entirely different questions. And I feel like you're addressing really more the first question, like, could there be life out there? Could there have been life before? Could there be life in the future? I agree with that. That's not I don't think that's unlikely at all. But I don't think we have anything to support that's been happening eternally. But as Martin will always come in and say, from our perspective of time frames and what we can even imagine, it might as well have been because it's so long. So does that make sense? Yes. I definitely have interest in the idea of life on other planets before us, now and later. I think is pretty likely and pretty cool.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to with Martin, and that's one of the general answers to just the issue of eternality, is that it just doesn't make any difference because the time scale that's involved to us is so long. It might as well be eternal from our perspective, from our point of view, as long as you don't allow the question to plant the seed in your mind of some supernatural factor. Then I agree that it makes no difference. Charles, I hope I didn't cut you off. Were you about to say something else?
No, not really. Just that it would just be unlikely for us, even in the future, to make contact just because of our level of technology and the distance required.
Yeah, I think that's is probably more something that we will enjoy thinking about, but may never
Mhm.
actually get to see in person.
I know there's a lot of articles out there about why life hasn't been discovered already and the issue of whether we should have discovered it already and whether all those things out there that I don't follow closely either. Some people get really interested in that, others don't. So it's just a matter of individual taste.
Now, do I think that we have already? And no.
I don't
All
know.
these.
Those faces they find on the moon and on Mars
Oh, so
are
funny.
convincing to me.
I have a theory about all these common visions of people being like carried by these beings and having rectal probes and so on. I think they're having their temperatures taken. I think they're remembering infant memories. And we used to use a lot of that. Used to be the main way, and it's still, if you really want to know if a newborn has a fever, you're going to have to check a rectal temperature. But more people are afraid of doing that now. It's just not the common thing. And so I'm wondering if now the alien abduction dreams are going to be axillary or forehead scanners or something like that. Anyway, that's my hypothesis about all the alien abductions. I think they're remembering being babies.
It would be very easy to go off on a discussion of UFOs and things like
Yeah,
that, which
yeah,
which,
right,
which
right.
I gather that they've been producing new videos in the last couple of months that supposedly the Navy or the government and so forth is. That's
I've been
probably
seeing,
not directly
I've,
related. Go ahead, Charles.
I've been seeing less and less of those videos lately compared to like the mid 2000s.
Yeah.
What's that guy? Whitney Stryber? There was a big explosion of all that stuff in the 90s, really, to me. I remember hearing a lot about all that. People were real excited about it, but there's still a dedicated crew.
Yeah, I was going to make that comment earlier when we were joking about the Star Trek episodes. It seems like maybe there's sort of a cultural thing that interest in these things ebbs and flows and comes
Yeah.
and goes. And maybe right now we're not as interested in these things. Back during the 60s, and I guess even the type of the movies and so forth today, it's a little bit different. It's not really a type of space exploration as much as it is a Star Wars or a type of sort of a fantasy thing that you might as well be happening on Earth or anywhere else as opposed to being really. It's not space exploration.
You're right. Yeah.
Or maybe it's a bit more grounded, like Blade Runner.
Yeah, it's just kind of a technology thing as opposed to just exploring the outer reaches of space and coming into contact with new life and new civilizations where no man has gone before, as Elaine knows by heart from watching all those Star Trek episodes.
Yeah, I don't know that there's much more that can be said about this section.
It was a small section.
Yeah, I was thinking it was long, but it actually is probably a little smaller than others. Now, I wonder if there's any relationship between, he's talking about this, you're taught by some philosophers that sensible things can come from sensible seeds. I wonder if there's an analogy or a relationship to this Stoic doctrine of divine
fire. Yeah.
I don't know whether the divine fire would have an attribute of having sensation, but I suppose if it's divine, it might well. Maybe there's at least an analogy, if not exactly what he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, if you go higher, not to the seeds, but to molecules and more complicated structures than elementary particles, you could think about carbon-based life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that makes me think of the Star Trek episode about the silicon-based life.
Yes.
See, I do know.
The Horta, if I recall correctly, that's the Horta. You mean that big blob that would sort of ooze along the floor? Yeah, the tunneling. Right. That's the Horta. Yes.
Yeah,
good.
So thinking of life coming from certain arrangements of elements, I think we see that that's the case. But if you go further down into the elementary particles, there's not so far as we know, a consciousness particle, right, that has to be involved. So yeah, again, what he has observed here, I think he's sticking more to observations here. So this is why this is still working. I don't think it's just luck. I think that the reasoning process is sticking closer to the evidence here. So I'm okay with what he's done.
Well, in the thread on EpicureanFriends.com, I've included a couple of, or two references that I think are sort of parallel here. There's a discussion in chapter 15 of Francis Wright's A Few Days in Athens, where they talk about how basically they use the word inert in that description, how inert particles can still have emerging properties that end up with consciousness. And I don't know that I'm going to read that while we're on the podcast this morning. And then I've also included a letter from Thomas Jefferson to John Adams in 1820, in which he kind of says basically the same thing. In fact, as I was posting this, I was wondering if he was plagiarizing from A Few Days in Athens, but I'm not sure which of the two came first. But Jefferson was making the point that someone who denies to nature the power of having thought processes arise from matter and says that that's too incredible to believe that a thinking thing could come from a non-thinking thing, that person needs to be asked how the sun can attract planets and how the motions of the universe can take place at a distance, because we don't understand that at all either. And yet planets are made of dirt, and yet dirt can, when combined together in ways that we don't understand, can produce all sorts of seemingly miraculous things. So I guess the point being that as hard as it may be for some people to accept that sensation and life and even consciousness can arise from things that don't have sensation and don't have consciousness, still that is the most likely explanation of the way things are.
Yeah.
All right, Charles, are you thinking of anything else we want to include today?
No, not really. Like you said earlier, I mean, this section is pretty small, and we've sort of said all that can be said at the moment before going deeper into Book 2. And eventually Book 3, where the mortality of the soul is discussed and sensation with the soul.
Yeah, well, hopefully this is the transition period where we've been focusing on some really detailed qualities of atoms, but now we're moving into that more controversial area that you're talking about, which is life itself. Because a lot of people are going to say they don't care about atoms, but they are going to say they do care about where life came from and whether there's a God and whether there's a supernatural creator that tells us how to live that life and things like that.
Right.
And whether we have life after death and those things. The life after death part is pretty closely parallel to what we're already talking about today.
Right.
All right. Well, we can begin to close then, Elaine.
All right. I hope y'all have a good week.
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully we'll have Martin back next week and we'll do another section.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.